About 2 weeks ago, I watched the first episode of Record of a Lost War, and for an anime from 1990, I was taken aback at the extremely fast pace of the story. So much so that after watching, I immediately wanted to compare it to Sousou no Frieren to see how they approached their story structure differently and how it had advanced in the last 30 years. Since then, I've watched a few more episodes of Lost War and realized only the first episode was paced in such a way, so I've dropped the comparison idea in order to focus solely on Frieren. So, since this started because of pacing, let's take a look at Frieren's pacing. First off, what is pacing? I define pacing by the rate of promises to payoffs, so let's see how that looks like in episode 21, since it's the fastest paced episode yet. The resolution is a little low, but you'll have to bear with it. Most evidently, you can see that the course of the episode is plotted by creating promises in the first half, with the majority of the payoffs happening in the latter half. Needless to say, from a Japanese story, you can expect the Kisho Tenketsu structure, both in the scale of the episode and of chapters. I'll link some videos by Smack if you don't know what that is. The middle black line here shows where chapter 44 ends, which also has its own 10. I was also curious what a slower paced episode looked like, so here's episode 1. Notice all those lines? The slower pace is supplemented by more of those scenes. The structure and pacing are only the bones of a story. The meat and meaning consist of things like character development, cool moments, or comedy. So, why can these things supplement a slower pace? Learning and convincing. That's what makes everything not boring. Payoffs are rewards for things that you learn. Remember Aura's death? That was pretty cool. But it didn't just exist for you to think, wait, she's goated. The story built up your knowledge of everything so that you knew Frieren would win. But it's not the satisfaction from guessing right that made it cool. It was the method. Imagine Goku fighting a baby. Actually, no, that'd be pretty interesting in a comedic sense. Imagine pitting a pit bull against a 5-year-old child. You know who's gonna win. But when you sit down and watch the fight, you won't feel gratified after the pit bull won, despite your bet being a product of your knowledge. You'll think, okay, that was a waste of time. What else could have possibly happened? What if the kid won? That'd be interesting. A testament to that kid's skill and what they've done to get up to that point. That's the typical way shonens get it done, turning the tides of a losing battle. If you heard about that in the news, you'd be intrigued. How did that kid win? What you're truly invested in is the method by which it was done. An anonymous user I asked put it well in saying, the point of her defeating Aura by turning her biggest dick wins spell against her is not, wow, Frieren has so much magic, she's so cool. It was to illustrate that she was the kind of person who was both compassionate enough to put herself in extra danger and exhaust herself, just to spare the corpses of men she knew their living descendants would like to properly bury, but also vicious enough to intentionally defeat Aura in a way she would find most humiliating, because she just fucking hates demons that much. The method by which things are done is the payoff, rather than the action itself. We learn about Frieren, the demons, why she hates them, and we are convinced she is right before we get that gratification. We knew she would win, but the way she got it done was satisfying. We saw the results of what we learned of her character and what she learned from Himmel, or rather, how she changed and grew. This may not be huge to some or even most of you, but to me, this was what made me understand character-driven stories. I always write like a children's story or a fairy tale where meaning is drawn from the action itself. So, what is used to teach us these things? On the most basic level, interpersonal relationships. You'll see every scene has 2 or more people in it, which is an aspect of all manga since they cannot explore thoughts as books do. There are many benefits to this. It creates opportunity to develop character, compare philosophies, or create conflict or suspense. It also makes it more difficult to insert wall of text exposition, though it can still happen. But interpersonal relationships also have to do with the themes of Frieren. The focus on time is also a focus on change, and what change is greater than those of people and others. Frieren's own goal is to learn about humans, so the journey is largely an emotional one. This is the heart of Frieren, which allows the story to have so many flashbacks. This is probably the most important thing to remember. Most of my analysis here is cold and distant, but you mustn't forget the warmth you feel when experiencing the story. That being said, let's continue by looking at examples of learning within episodes 7 to 10 in order to find out how the climax of what essentially boils down to I have more mana than you was made so interesting. Episode 7 starts off the journey proper with the party established. The first half of this episode is removed of the arc, but is good for seeing the composition of a story in a small scale. We first learn about Flam being treated like a fairy tale at this point, immediately establishing the chapter's theme about history. After framing this recollection as a dream, we get some comedy. As we learn of the new party's interpersonal relationships, the addressing of the landslide mentions the demons, which isn't quite a promise, but more of a hint at what is to come. Afterwards, we learn more about elves, which has natural interest to us, while also touching on the subject of remembering history. The scene of a burning swing also acts as a hint, as when Frieren talks about elves being close to the end, she foreshadows what we later learn was an order by the demons to kill all elves. Of course, this has to do with the upcoming arc. Next is the climax and the emotional high point, where they start talking about the Liberation Festival, both as an explanation for the merchant's travels and for a direct address to the themes, defending the idea of a festival as a dedication to quickly fading memory. The flashback that follows mirrors Himmel's memory to Flam's, and that they really existed, to make us share Frieren's perspective about their places in time. This is where Chapter 13 ends, and where Chapter 14 starts off the demon arc. As an introduction to this part of the story, we immediately learn that Frieren's views on demons are different than most, as she acts out in town and we learn of the circumstances. The demons are peace envoys. This, of course, creates a natural conflict between our characters, and creates a promise that we'll learn why Frieren views them differently. But I'm focusing on what we learn rather than promises. Lugna addresses the differences in views, and in this, we learn Frieren's precise feelings about them. Then, in jail, we learn of Aura, more context surrounding the peace envoys, and then, in Frieren's flashback to the demons, we are convinced of her views. In this, we also learn a bit more about demons, how they have no family, and why they imitate speech. In the next scene, Lugna confirms what we learned. Afterwards, we shift topics of learning. We begin to learn the conflict between the demons and Mr. Granat. We also learn of his doubt in the demons' intentions, his own intentions, and, needlessly mentioning the suspense, we are also convinced of the demon's malicious use of a language as a solution to the suspense by his false empathy. You might think we were already convinced of this through Frieren's flashback, but that only mentioned language in passing near the end. It acted more as a promise to touch on the subject later, which is now. Then we learn of the demon's intentions, with the barrier and Aura's army and whatnot. This is the why of the conflict of this whole arc. By the end, with Drat, we learned Frieren's position against these demons in terms of power. She thinks she is stronger than Aura. This will come up later. Episode 8 starts with a fight between Frieren and Drat. From this scene, I can only really scrape her mercilessness towards demons, that she thinks demons used to be more skilled, and with the dead guard, we learn her plan to get a pardon. We learn Fern and Stark's plan to help Frieren, and learn how Stark feels about the situation. With Stark's recent addition to the story, we linger on his character a little, as the story tries to convey that bravery lies in acting despite fear, as per his character arc. As Mr. Granat confronts Lugna about Drat being missing, we learn that Mr. Granat is not only competent, but smart in realizing Frieren was not responsible for the death of his guard. This scene genuinely impressed me, because I've come to expect misunderstandings causing issues in anime. Unless your story has a theme of communication, I do not want to see that in there. Anyway, soon we see the demons' willingness to use force and learn precisely how the demons, or at least Lugna, use words only as weapons, and so is violent in nature even when speaking. We learn Frieren's worries about the circumstances, though as viewers we know they're unfounded, and we see Fern and Stark bring up the issue of demons to Frieren. Here we learn she trusts him. It's nothing vital, but it's an important aspect of her character. We soon learn about the demon's propensity for magic, but at the same time learn about Lugna's personal views on progress, development, and effort as is relevant to the plot and theme, since we also learn Flam created the barrier. During the flashback, I guess we can also see how caring or gentle Flam is in protecting a sapling. Small things like this may seem negligible, but they are important to the character development of characters that spend the majority of their time off-screen. After this, as Mr. Granat is locked up, we learn the stakes, and along with this, his willingness to die for the sake of the town. As Lugna and Linny walk in on Stark trying to save Mr. Granat, his views from earlier are confirmed, as Lugna barely considers him. We only learn the plan of attack as it happens, with Fern's surprise attack. As they escape, we learn they have blood on them as a promise that there will be further fighting, but more importantly, Fern's teaching have unknowingly been altered specifically to kill demons. This is an extension of Frieren, of course, where we can also learn of her utter hatred towards demons, how she feels rather than simply what she thinks about them. The same was done in Drat's fight. I know I'm getting repetitive, but how many writers would have thought to add such a scene after the fighting was over? Episode 9, relative to Aura's death, establishes the winning conditions of the battle. First, we learn a bit of history in that Aura has attacked before, which also serves as a link to Frieren and Aura's meeting. We learn Aura thinks she has the advantage, which is contrary to Frieren believing herself stronger. But, of course, someone has to be right. Switching scenes here allows us to learn about Aura's gimmick, the 7 stages of destruction's position relative to humans, and allows us to assume the cause of Granat's son's death. Granat also establishes what is needed to win here, that simply being more mana. But in reaction to this, he also states an exception. This gives us alleyways in terms of imagining how Frieren will beat Aura. Returning to the battle, we learn why Frieren goes through the extra effort to dispel the living dead, or rather, Himmel's effect on her. This is also an addressing of themes looking at respecting the dead, both in sparing the dead suits of armor and respecting Himmel's words after his death, made significant by Aura not understanding why. The next scene where Stark decides to ask Frieren for help isn't all too important, but I do want to mention it just because, despite the author clearly wanting them to face off against the demons without her, made them make rational decisions that simply went wrong. It's believable. My most sincere respect to Kanehito Yamada. The rest of the episode is mostly fighting, so there isn't much for me to say, and I'm getting tired of this, and you get to the point by now anyway. This episode is near the end of the arc, or rather, volume 2 of the manga, so these battles serve to finalize Frieren Stark's characters as a result of their teachers and make them their own. Now, episode 10 focuses on the feelings and philosophies of the demons on magic. We learn their arrogance, overconfidence, and pride in it. This is what influences their character, leads to their downfall, and makes Aura's death humiliating. Frieren hiding her magic is like spitting on the demon's philosophy. In addition, we learn more about Frieren, Vlam, and their past together. Blending together what we learn, we are shown scenarios that convince us of these things. The scene where Vlam eviscerates the demons shows us the demons' views in practice, along with Vlam's hidden mana technique's effectiveness. Less directly, around this event, we are shown their hatred of demons by both Vlam and Frieren's willingness to hide their magic, despite it being a discourtesy to their love of it. Keen viewers may have noticed that the convincing in this case, which is the scene I just spoke about, happens before we are properly introduced to the demon's views on magic. In this episode, the convincing and learning were reversed, though hints were given earlier. Most of what we learn of the demon's philosophy around magic comes from Frieren and Vlam walking together in not ancient Greece, discussing it as part of demon society and actively comparing it to how humans operate with money, but only after we see the demons concite in that evisceration scene. Between their meeting and their contemplation of demons, we are shown a bit of the present, talking about how Aura doesn't conceal her mana, which creates more immediacy for the second flashback. Before continuing, I'd like to address the fact that only episode 10 has a focus in terms of learning. Why? Well, in terms of present matters of consequence, very little actually happens in this episode. All of this contextualization happens right before Aura's death, 1. For the reasons I've already listed, 2. To explain the decisions and hubris in what is about to happen, and 3. Recency bias. If this information was revealed earlier, that scene would not have gone as hard as it did. It's also possible to reveal information after the fact, but at that point it would have become exposition, since the topic would no longer be relevant to any solution. Revealing information only after something has happened is most apt for murder mysteries, where the readers are given their answer sheet to see what they got right. The following scene where Vlam and Frieren talk about loving magic is not directly related to the immediate conflict, but it has to do with the theme, time, how it is spent, and why. Why learn more than revenge magic? Why learn the magic that creates a field of flowers? In terms of why this scene was put here, I can only say that the opportunity presented itself. The story was already on the topic of their past, after all, but this scene shows us a part of Frieren's past beyond her hatred of demons. It further develops her character and shows us more about why she hunts grimoires the way she does. The flower spell was also mentioned in episode 2, so it's a nice callback. Same thing with Vlam and Frieren's relationship being mirrored in the same episode by Frieren and Fern, saying they're not so different.
ねえ、先に一つ聞いていい？魔法は好き？ほどほどでございます。私と同じだ。
フリーレン、まだ魔法は好きか？
突然どうしたの先生。ほどほどかな。
But given the flowers are more meaningful to episode 2 than 10, I'd say the author worked chronologically, at least independent of arcs, and included this scene by feel, especially since it's the loosest scene in the episode. The continuation to show Frieren along the years up to meeting the party for the first time was included for this same reason, I suspect, while also showing us more of her past and simply creating a link between past and present. But if Kanehito Yamada writes the broad story chronologically, what about each arc? Did he write everything with consideration for the particular end he wanted for Aura? Or was Aura killed in such a way because of what he's already written? Remember how in episode 8, Lugna stated he could track Stark and Fern because his blood was on their clothes? I think that was a very impromptu decision in order to have them fight despite making the rational decision to go get their parental guardian. Tracking people with blood is just a very strange idea. This makes me think that Kanehito Yamada knew that Stark and Fern would have to fight the demons for the sake of the story, but didn't know how to make it seem natural, so came up with a last-ditch idea to force them to fight before the weekly deadline came up. Respect for keeping up such a high quality of writing on a weekly schedule, though. I can't really know for certain, but with the tightness of the story plus this, I can only suspect that Kanehito Yamada writes arcs and chapters backwards, that is, with specific goals, themes, and intentions in mind. And I know, just earlier I said the broad story is written chronologically, but with the name dropped in chapter 17, or rather episode 8, I think Kanehito Yamada knew the general story at least up until then, but I might be mistaken since Soso means something along the lines of one who attends a funeral, so the name could have been decided by the first chapter alone. I also think it's a pretty safe bet to say that he uses a word cloud method, as mentioned by Smack, for theme rather than any one solid philosophy. It grants him more flexibility in writing, as in chapter 13, or the beginning of episode 7, where they talk about Flam being as old as a fairy tale. Things like this only work so well when you have vague themes such as time and memory. On the other hand, a fully developed message is better for something like a short story, like in Tsukimizu's Flan Wants to Die. This might be a difference between character-driven and plot-driven stories, or at the very least, it correlates. I love these series that are about vague things like reaching the top of some apocalyptic structure or reaching heaven. They allow for loose journeys like this where the most mundane things can be explored, and yet still be meaningful. I guess that's how Eastern thinking is. Meanwhile, Western paintings have focal points and stories have precise messages. I've heard some people criticize this show because Frieren is overpowered. Well, no, that's wrong. I've heard people talking about people complaining about it. If these people are real, my response is to say that those people are stupid. The point of conflict in this series is not any sort of battle or power level, it's the difference in the lives lived of the people who fight. I understand that having an OP protagonist raises some red flags because of its use in trash media in order to get girls to meaninglessly swoon over some bland main character, but if you've seen even a moment of the show, you would know those fears are unfounded and power has no bearing on the meaning of the story. Some may point out that Frieren won over Aura simply because she has more mana, but that's not the point. The point of that battle in particular was exactly as the anonymous user put it earlier. Along with this, the themes don't require of the story any sort of training arc, since it's not a typical shonen with themes of "I'll work hard" or something. In fact, the themes encourage at least one long-lived overpowered character to directly illustrate the difference in technological progress over time, just like the fight against Qual, and I didn't even have that in mind when I made that suggestion. This show does have its faults though, especially in some anime-only scenes. After writing the majority of this, episode 24 dropped, and while watching, I instantly started asking questions about the scene where Frieren finds a secret room. I only read the manga up until the still exam, so I didn't initially know it was anime only, but after asking about it online, I realized, and the reason for the poor writing quality became apparent. So here's how not to execute a scene. First off, her being certain of a secret room is based off nothing we know. There was no contextualization about it, no prior mentions of secrets like this, and she only noticed it because she did. Her finding it meant nothing, like Otto's death would have been if we didn't get the flashbacks. To make it seem a bit more natural, they could have inserted a few scenes where she toyed with contraptions, set some off on accident, and made this discovery by chance. It wouldn't have made it good, but better. Would have at least let us in on her gambling tendencies, as in the short about her and the mimics. But it's not this finding that I have a problem with. What really gets me is when they're actually inside. In short, it would have been no different if Frieren entered alone. No objections were raised, and the characters don't learn anything about each other. There's no suspense or tension, and we learn nothing of relevance either. They made passing mention of the king buried here and of the Unified Dynasty era, but only that. Passing. Then they just walked away. No flags were raised that this would be touched on later, and it had no immediate relevancy. If it happened by the end of the dungeon, it would have made some sense, but even then, as it is, it has no thematic significance either. It could have made a great point about the preserving of history for no reason other than sentiment, as done by Doom, which is what the dungeon is. They could have talked about Himmel or the other party members learning lessons from historical tales, and then merge that in with the king and his legacy or something. But instead, nothing happens at all. I can barely even talk about this due to its shallow nature. No comedy, no suspense, no promises, no payoffs, no learning, no convincing, no action, no character development, no theme, no meaning. Pointless. It means nothing to me. Every action taken and every word spoken was meaningless. Not even a conversation was had. Am I being too critical of a scene made to just fill up 3 minutes? Yeah. Overall it's acceptable, but only because of everything it's surrounded by. If the whole show were like this, there'd be nothing to like. Should have just let me write it. I'd work as an unpaid intern. Well, in the end, I don't know how helpful this analysis has been. It certainly did help me in some regards, but in others it has been a detriment. Frieren's circumstances are unique in that, thanks to its themes, it can have such a high frequency of flashbacks. If any other show did this, it'd be inappropriate. So, thanks to this, I've forgotten how to write a story without flashbacks. Maybe I'll have to analyze something more typical, like Girls Last Tour, next time. But who can say how efficient analysis is? Analysis itself is Western, and in attempting to analyze the contextual nature of an Eastern story, perhaps I've soiled it for myself. Maybe I should rewatch or reread without trying to categorize anything or draw any lines, but remain in an analytical lens. Is that even possible?